Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. We've been hearing a lot about the Israel-Hamas war after Hamas overran Israeli towns and murdered over 1,400 people. Curiously enough, while leaving many signs of their presence, Hamas also did not fail to mention Fatah, the Palestinian authority's governing party, which at times has been a bitter rival of Hamas. Many people have come out in support of Israel, but no fewer have unfortunately come out in support of Hamas, making assorted excuses for the invasion and butchery. Not the least of those have been noteworthy figures like the Saudi Prince Turki Al Faisal, who joined the choir, claiming that the context for this attack was not unprovoked, but rather the occupation of Palestinian territories over decades. As a reminder, Gaza has been under Hamas control since 2005, and it is incredibly disingenuous to claim that it has been during this period of time in any way occupied. But what about Judea and Shomron, the area that is known to much of the world as the West Bank, and parts of which are under the Palestinian Authority control, under the control of Mahmoud Abbas? Is it faring any different? And the question is, of course, the Palestinian Authority has been seen and touted as the good partner for potential peace negotiations, for potential state building for Palestinians, and for the potential coexistence between Israel and the Palestinian Arab population next to it. Hamas we have heard a lot about how it was erroneous to give any money to Hamas to support it, but the Palestinian Authority is supposed to be different. Is it really? What steps has the PA taken towards state building, and has everything they've done been constructive, or are they just a different face of the same violent struggle against Israel? Joining our program today to discuss some of the lesser known details about PA activity, which is contributing to some of the violence we are seeing today, including, by the way, a new campaign of violent incitement, a pay for slay program announced by the Palestinian Authority to the tune of at least $3 million that we know of. Joining us today for that, Karys, Rhea, and Naomi, Kahn. Karys is the associate producer of American Thought Leaders and Cash's Corner at the Epoch Times and a fellow at the Jewish Leadership Project. She also works in the Middle East Forum and Based Records, and she's written for various publications such as Commentary, New York Daily News, and Newsweek, among many others. She started out as a broadcast journalist, and she's also had an academic focus on counterterrorism and homeland security. In her previous life, she was touring the world as a drama and songwriter before becoming disillusioned with the music industry. Nevertheless, she continues to release music in her spare time, in addition to writing short stories. She has recently written a series of articles about the illegal settlements by the Palestinian Authority, and all of that was inspired by research by our other guest today, Naomi Linder, who is the director of the International Division at Regavim, which is an NGO dedicated to the preservation of Israel's resources through universal and unbiased enforcement of law. Something that could be said is severely lacking in this context. Thank you so much for joining the Washington Outsider Report today. Karys, Naomi, welcome to the show. I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourselves, how you ended up going into this particular avenue of research. What made you look into these illegal settlements that no one has heard of before the articles that were published in the last few months.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me and Naomi, Irina. I am a big fan of your work. As you know, I booked you for a webinar on Middle East Forum. So it's a pleasure to be here as a guest on your show. So, Naomi's really the expert on this topic here, but the reason why I became interested in writing a piece, which ended up being the longest article I've ever written, it's about 7,000 words, was because, I really hadn't seen much about this in other than in Jewish or Israeli media. And it's a dimension of the conflict that is just never talked about, right? I mean, you never ever hear this on any sort of mainstream news network. You never hear people talking about the illegal land construction by the Palestinian Authority in violation of the Oslo Accords in Area C. And it's a very nuanced topic, but it adds an entirely different dimension to this conflict, and it really frames the entire thing in a different light. So I was very familiar with Regavim and Im Tertzu, another organization working in Judea and Samaria, and they were putting out just fabulous reports and research about this problem. And I really thought it was so important to get it to a Western audience, which is why I'm very, very happy that Western Journal published it. Also, it's going to be published in full, right? The Western Journal published it. They serialized it in 10 parts, but the Gatestone Institute is about to republish it, but in full, in one piece. So you can read the whole thing on one website. So yeah, that's how I got into this, and I'm very curious to hear how Naomi did. I have some ideas.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you both for giving me an opportunity to talk about this issue. As an aside, I'd like to address some of the things that Irina raised about the Palestinian Authority, whether or not it is a viable partner for peace in light of what we've seen recently and in light of the research that we've been doing for many years that is reflected in this series of articles, this very, very important series of articles that Karys wrote and is published in Western Journal. Regavim has been researching the situation on the ground, land use policy and land use reality throughout the land of Israel, including Judea and Samaria, since its foundation 17 years ago. We've been tracking construction and not only tallying the quantity of construction, but also connecting those dots and analyzing the quality of that illegal construction and what emerges, the picture that emerges from it. The use of Israel's land resources, which is clearly its most rare and most sought after, most fought over resource, is the policy that surrounds those decisions about who uses the land and for what purposes really is the most basic expression of the nation's sovereignty. And we have found that that is being abused badly. And we began to understand that it was not coincidental, it was not incidental. It is a massive, well-funded campaign of annexation that is aimed at threatening not Israel's presence not only in Judea and Samaria, but its existence as a whole. What we've seen in recent days is actually just an expression of what might happen if this trend of annexation that is funded mostly by the European Union and carried out by the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria is left unchecked, because what we saw down south in Israel was the overrun of southern Israel by that border community. But if Judea and Samaria, if we lose control there, all of Israel will be in range of and susceptible to the exact same types of attack that we saw 2 weeks ago. I would also add that, going back to what Irina began with, that the Palestinian Authority has proven both in deeds and in words, and particularly over the last 2 weeks, that it is not a partner for peace and never has been. We're about to release, hopefully later this afternoon, we will release a montage, really, of statements made by top Palestinian Authority officials praising and encouraging the massacre, the butchery, the incredible cruelty and anti-Semitism of the pogrom that was carried out in southern Israel, calling upon all Palestinian Authority police, all of whom are armed by the State of Israel and the United States, to carry out exactly the same types of operations throughout Judea and Samaria and within Israel itself. They make these statements publicly. These are not statements we have made. These are not words we've put into their mouths. We've simply collected their public statements on official Palestinian Authority television, on social media, and in other fora. And I would point out also that although the Hamas charter is extremely clear about its objectives, from the river to the sea means the full eradication of the State of Israel, the Palestinian Authority's first condition under the Oslo framework was to change the Palestinian charter. The charter still, to this day, calls for violent confrontation and the eradication of the State of Israel. They continue to educate their children and continue to train them to dehumanize Jews all over the world, and Israelis in particular. And this has not changed, and it's only gained traction. But what we're talking about today, the illegal construction, is a physical expression of the project of annexation in Judea and Samaria that has been wildly successful, particularly because of foreign support. When the Oslo framework was first created and the division of territory was laid out, the division of Judea and Samaria, of the West Bank, quote unquote, was 60-40. 60% to the State of Israel, 40% to the Palestinian Authority. Today, through illegal construction and illegal agricultural annexation, the shift has been complete, and it is now 60-40 in the other direction, meaning 20% of the territory has already been lost to Palestinian Authority hostile takeover, and the State of Israel has not acted against it because of international pressure. So that's how I got into all of this.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add really quickly, Irina, you mentioned the Pay for Slay, right? The Martyrs Fund, this protocol that they have, the PA, of paying terrorists to commit attacks on Israel and paying families of terrorists who were killed or are in jail. And I just read on Palestinian Media Watch that despite the PA and Hamas being rivals, the PA is going to be paying families of some 1,500 of these terrorists who just committed this massacre of Israelis close to $2 million. I think actually more than $2 million for this latest attack. I mean, so I think that really shows also that the PA is just, like you surmised, a different side of the same coin.
So that brings me to a question. This year is the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords, which most people consider have completely failed in their purpose. And you started your article, or serialized articles, with describing the actual nature of the law that emerged from the Oslo Accords that divided the territory between Israel, and the Palestinian authorities, areas A, B, and C. Could you describe for our audience what exactly that means? Because I have a feeling that most people are completely not familiar with that concept. And so when the media discusses the so-called illegal settlements by Israel, a lot of the times they are wading in very murky for them territory and, quite frankly, disinforming the public.
Absolutely. The Oslo Accords is never mentioned. I mean, rarely mentioned in the Western media, right? I mean, and especially by anti-Israel purveyors, when they say something like, oh, Israel is committing apartheid in the West Bank, right? People who understand the division of land through the Oslo Accords we roll our eyes, because we're like, area A, which is where most of the Palestinians live, is under complete governance of the Palestinian Authority. So it's absolutely impossible for Israel to be committing apartheid because there's no jurisdiction there. So yeah, I mean, to summarize, and Naomi will add to it, the Oslo Accords, Oslo II in 1995, it split up the area into 3 jurisdictions, Area A, B, and C. Area A, it was decided, and again, this was agreed upon by Yasser Arafat, then the leader of the Palestinians, and it was witnessed by the European Union and President Bill Clinton, and this divided the area into Area A, which was controlled completely by the Palestinian Authority, both civilly and militarily. They agreed that Area B would be controlled by the Palestinian Authority civilly, right? The civil institutions, but Israel would still be in charge of peripheral security, and Area C would be under the complete jurisdiction of Israel. So this created this basically created a situation where the Palestinians didn't have any sort of legal basis for extending themselves beyond the areas that they were in control of. And yet, as Naomi said, and what this article is about, the Palestinians have been violating that consistently for decades by building illegally outside of their zones into Area C in a very, very strategic way that kind of had its basis in the Fayed Plan of 2009. And they've been doing it with complete full support of the European Union, even though the European Union knows that this is illegal and it is within Israel's legal right to demolish any sort of structure that is built.
Naomi, would you like to add to that?
I certainly would. Just to give a bigger picture, the Oslo framework looked at the situation on the ground and said, okay, the object here is to give to create a Palestinian Authority that will control the lives on all civil matters of as many non-Jewish residents of the territory as possible, to reduce the contact between Arabs and the Israeli authority structure. So the Palestinian Authority was created knowing that Area A was simply the large concentrations of urban Arab populations in Judea and Samaria, the big cities that you've heard of. Area B were the larger villages or village clusters, and they were created specifically as islands within the larger Area C in order to prevent contiguity so that Israel could still control its own security and protect Israel proper and also the Jewish communities of Area C. The Palestinian Authority has, over the years, very carefully, strategically undermined that entire framework by building illegally in order to connect up all of the things that were left disconnected in order to create a contiguous land mass. Now, until 2 weeks ago, that would have been bad enough. But our most recent study of where the illegal construction is, the map shows shocking things. And we create our maps by simply taking a full aerial survey of the entire Judea and Samaria and marking out where every single structure is, and then investigating each and every one. Where is it? Who built it? By what right? Does it have a permit? Who's in charge of that area? What is its legal status? So some of the things that we found, for example, and this goes to the two main claims that you will hear against Israel. Number one is, well, the Palestinians have to live somewhere, and Israel never gives them permits to build in Area C. So, of course, Israel needs not give them permits to build in Area C because they have full jurisdiction in areas A and B. How many permits did this Palestinian Authority give for Jewish construction in areas A and B? 0. That is undermining the entire principle of this division of the land. On the other hand, what we've also found is, and what you'll hear very often is, the Palestinians have a terrible crisis. They have to live somewhere and Israel doesn't give them permits, so they build illegally. So we did a full survey of areas A and B, the areas under Palestinian Authority control. And what we found is that nearly 70% of those territories are empty and available for construction. And those are the places that the Palestinian Authority was created to develop in order to make a livable, thriving Palestinian society in areas under its jurisdiction where there would be no conflict with the Israeli authorities. So if 70% of it is empty and available, and all of the Palestinian resources, the massive foreign aid and development aid and educational aid and nutritional support aid, all of this money is being poured into massive illegal construction, specifically in Area C. It is clearly politically motivated, and it is clearly not a humanitarian issue. It is a political issue. It is a strategic issue. And the map is being changed under the guise of humanitarian concerns that don't exist.
Yeah, in addition, the Palestinian Authority, they don't do like a census in the region. They don't report deaths or any emigration from Area C. So it allows the Europeans and the public to believe that the areas are flooded with Arabs and they need to build in these other areas, and Israel doesn't do anything to help that because COGAT doesn't provide any sort of census of their area either. COGAT is the Israeli the Israeli unit within the IDF that's in charge, this what's known as the civil administration, they're in charge of administering the territories, basically governing the territories. And they don't provide any sort of census either, so that people can really understand what's at stake here in terms of the numbers of Jews and Arabs living in these regions.
What I see here emerging from this, and I will get back to the point about the European Union in a moment, but what I see here emerging is a strange pattern. As much as there's been blame for Netanyahu's Hamas-oriented program of attempting to basically work with Qatar to provide Hamas with financial incentives to govern as opposed to terrorize, we are seeing exactly the same pattern with respect to the PA, where the Israeli government has essentially ignored violations of the law in favor of this creeping mission of the Palestinian Authority, which does not necessarily address the needs of the Palestinian population as much as violate the needs of the Israeli population, or at least it channels those needs in a particular way, which is completely unnecessary and illegal. So where does the structural deference to the Palestinian Authority come from? Why is there such a reluctance to engage? Is there such a fear of a wider conflict breaking out as a result of enforcing the law that the Israeli government basically gave up and figured it's better to let them do what they're going to do than to engage and enforce?
I'd love to address.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. It's not a fear of a conflict with the Palestinian Authority. It's a fear of conflict with the Palestinian Authority's supporters. We have a massive face-off particularly with the European Union and the European member states. And it's explicit and it is extremely adamant, to the point where when Israel's Supreme Court, which is not known to be particularly right-wing, as a matter of fact, quite the opposite, and is probably the greatest defender of Palestinian rights in the world, when it finds that a certain structure or cluster of structures is illegal, is endangering both the lives of the people living in it and the state of Israel as a whole, and orders that and decides that these structures can be demolished and the people relocated, the European Union issues explicit threats to cut off all trade, academic cooperation, bilateral projects, all of these things, if any of these illegal structures, which it has helped to fund and to build, are touched. So they are actually threatening Israel with massive sanctions, whereas Israel is trying to uphold the law and improve the lives of everyone concerned. Israel has done so far beyond what any normal state would do in terms of trying to accommodate the people who are being used by the Palestinian Authority to populate these illegal clusters that are the driving force behind annexation. But still, the European Union, and it goes back to what Karys was saying before, there is no census, and Israel has not conducted a census of how many people are really involved here on the non-Israeli side. How many Arab residents are there in areas under Israeli jurisdiction? How many people do we need to provide for? There's no census because Israel, and again, there's also no land survey or registration. There's very, very little law enforcement. Why is all of that? Because Israel has been made very painfully aware by the Europeans, who are supposed to be upholders of international law and allies of the only democracy in the Middle East, that if they do uphold the law and create some sort of order out of the chaos, they will be accused of war crimes. They will become a pariah state. They will be sanctioned economically. And so the state of Israel does not do any of the things that the sovereign or the person in charge, jurisdiction of any kind, even as an occupier, is required to do under international law. The Europeans essentially are forcing the state of Israel not to uphold international law and are encouraging the Palestinian Authority to violate international law. And that's a situation that can no longer be allowed, in my opinion, to continue. It is driving the entire region to conflict and cannot be resolved by peaceful means when one side knows that it will have the full support for any outrageous thing, any outrageous violation of international law that it chooses to commit.
Yeah, and just to put it in perspective with numbers and show how inadequate Israel has been, and correct me if these numbers have changed, Naomi, but on average, there's about 7 illegal structures built per day by the Palestinian Authority, with a total of about 3,500 every single year. And Israel tears down around 200 or 250. And these are usually insignificant structures that they tear down, like a garage or an animal pen, or structures that, are just, like Naomi said, particularly hazardous, near a highway or a military compound, or can be used as a launching pad for terrorists. So, I mean, this is really incredible. I mean, they as of today, they've erected about over 90,000 illegal structures, paved 1,200 miles of new roads, put up thousands of electricity poles, and used agricultural projects as well to take over Israeli state land. They've also there's been horrific abuses of the environment in doing so, right? They built on nature reserves, right? I mean, the European Union is supposedly this champion of environmental rights, and yet they are building in nature reserves, which is explicitly prohibited in the Y Plantations Accord, which is a Y Plantations agreement, which is part of the Oslo Accords. Is that correct, Naomi? And correct. And also when they build these illegal structures, that creates a lot of waste itself. There's all of these junkyards, and it ends up affecting the waterways with sewage. I mean, it's just a horrific situation for everyone involved. And yet the European Union is actively funding this, encouraging this, and in fact, they all of their spatial plans for this area are available. If you go to the OCHA's website, the Office of Humanitarian and Space, what is it? I don't even know the full, who knows, right? Just another bureaucratic bloated UN agency, alphabet soup, right? But if you go to OCHA's website, like they have the spatial development plans on there. They have the whole kind of area C mapped out, and the illegal structures that they want to be building and that they have built. So it's really it's such a, talk about crimes against humanity, right? And yet it's right under our nose. They're not even really hiding it, and yet the world is just silent.
There's an additional.
Go ahead.
Sorry, there's an additional. I mean, the European Union and the United Nations are so up to their necks in all of this that we recently actually collected a few examples of UNESCO helping the Palestinian Authority decimate World Heritage Sites. UNESCO, I will remind you, is the United Nations agency responsible for education. They continue to fund the Palestinian Authority despite the anti-Semitic insightful curricula, and also in charge of preservation of World Heritage Sites. The decimation of archaeological sites in areas under Palestinian Authority control that are specifically outlined in the Oslo Accords, Annex 11 of the Oslo Accords, places full responsibility for preservation of certain sites in the hands of the Palestinian Authority. They're building condominiums, for example, on the ancient city of Jericho. This is a World Heritage Site. The damage that they have already done to so many of these ancient sites is irreparable, places that are lost to humanity and to science forever. They continue to do so, and the United Nations, through its various agencies, continues to assist them in doing this. So we have, essentially, Israel is not afraid of confronting the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is essentially the very small tail that's wagging the very big dog of the United Nations and the European Union. And that's who Israel is not confronting.
Yeah, and I also think, which I say in my article, this is just me kind of surmising, but I also think one of the reasons that Israel doesn't really deal with this problem is because since the area is under military control, essentially, the military isn't necessarily equipped to deal with such a problem mentally, right? They're not really, they're concerned with tactical threats, right? And they're not looking at this as a long-term national security threat, right? To them, it's political. And as opposed to if Area C was actually, if Kogat was dissolved, as Regavim has called for, and Area C was annexed by Israel completely and fell under Israeli law, then you could actually have a comprehensive government and different different intelligence agencies and whatnot looking at this problem and figuring out how much of a threat is this, because this is not like an immediate threat like maybe Iran getting a nuclear bomb, which we're hearing now is just weeks away, or like what happened with Hamas. I mean, this is a stealth, long-term, insidious kind of drip problem that one day is just going to you're going to wake up and oh my God, the Palestinians have taken over all of Judea and Samaria. And so because it's not as immediate, and because it's happening, it's a non-violent kind of it's a non-violent erasure of Israel's existence, as opposed to actually killing Jews and killing Israelis. The Israeli government can really, and Kogat specifically, can kind of put it on the back burner.
So this leads to a few points. First of all, there's clearly an existential long-term security threat rivaling what Hamas has done by other means, but nevertheless very much along similar lines. Second, the more the European Union with Palestinian help erases the history and the nature reserves and so forth, the easier for them is to make post factum claims that none of it was there to begin with, and to basically deny Israeli and Jewish historical presence in the area. And the third, while it is notoriously difficult to challenge massive, well-funded political institutions such as the UN and the European Union through lobbying and political means, legal means seem to be at Israel's disposal, because all these countries are horribly afraid of being embarrassed. So the question is, what can be done about this? Is there any way to actually challenge this this situation through legal institutions?
Well,
I'll let Naomi take that, because she's actually she's doing the things.
we're trying to do those things. One of the things that I would point out, which is, you hit the nail on the head, Irina, and that is the erasure of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, particularly starting in the heartland of biblical Israel is Judea and Samaria. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't visit Tel Aviv, and they didn't hang out in Haifa. They were in Shiloh, and they were in Jericho, and the Bible happened in Judea and Samaria. UNESCO recently held another vote, one in a series, and it wasn't the first, and it won't be the last, unfortunately, granting recognition to Palestinian heritage sites. So now the Tomb of the Patriarchs, where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Leah, Rebecca, and Leah are all buried, is now a Palestinian heritage site. The same is true of Jericho. The same is true of the capital of the Israelite kingdom in Samaria, the city of Shomron. The same is true of Hasmonean fortresses, and the list goes on and on. The Temple Mount, need I say more? The Temple Mount is now considered by the United Nations and UNESCO a Palestinian heritage site, and all reference to Jewish history at that place, the epicenter of Jewish worship and the place to which Jews for thousands of years have turned in prayer, is erased officially. So we're losing that battle. And it is quite bizarre. But it's an expression of how this war is being fought. As Karys said, it's a quiet war, it's a bloodless war, but it won't stay that way. And that's exactly what we've seen down south. For years, the state of Israel has been, I believe, a hostage to this concept that if we create material incentives, we will somehow maintain peace until a final political resolution is achieved. We will maintain peace and quiet by allowing Gaza's men and women to come in and work in Israel and earn a decent living. We will attain peace with the Palestinian Authority if we continue to provide them with essentially free electricity, to provide all of the people who are living there with what they don't get from the Palestinian Authority, which is healthcare and an opportunity for a better life and livelihood, to accept students in all of Israel's universities. Over and over and over again, we have warned that we're being played for fools, and this exploded in Gaza, in the Gaza border communities 2 weeks ago. Apparently, for years, the Palestinian workers from Gaza who came in with Israeli work permits every day were collecting intelligence and reported back to their Hamas handlers, so that the terrorists who came over, swarmed the border, had precise intelligence about every single family, home, business, community, kibbutz down in the south of Israel. They knew how many people lived in each one. They knew whether or not they had a dog. They knew whether or where the rooms in each house were situated, if anyone in the house had a firearm. All of these things, all of the operational information about where there's a guard post, where there are cameras, all of these things were collected by the people that Israel hoped to come to some sort of détente with by allowing them to earn a decent living and live a dignified life as neighbors of Israel. The Palestinian Authority and Hamas neither have any interest in actually improving the lives of the people they're in charge of. None of the people in their territories have any sort of social safety net that we would recognize. There is no social security, there is no health care, there is nothing. All of their resources, and there are now videos coming out of Hamas themselves showing and glorifying how they dug up all the water pipes to use them to launch rockets at Israel. They don't care that people are living in squalor, in subhuman conditions, all throughout Gaza, all throughout the Gaza Strip. They don't care that people are being used as human shields. They don't care about any of the things that a partner for peace should care about if there's going to be any improvement towards peace. Israel has had a rude awakening that this is what Hamas is, and we've had a rude awakening which we intend to publicize very, very clearly this evening with a collection of Palestinian Authority statements that there is no difference between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and ISIS. They all use the same tactics, and they all have the same goals, and that is simply genocide. So that's what we're up against here. And it begins with the quiet things of creeping annexation, eradication of the Jewish connection to this territory, redefining the entire narrative, and promoting a lie which, unfortunately, their European sponsors are eager to accept.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say something really quick, and then I have a question for you, Naomi. You know, over the course of writing this this article, this series of articles, and understanding the sinister role that the Europeans are playing in this, what became clear to me is that what is happening here is basically an extension of the European anti-Semitism from the Holocaust being shifted onto this region, right? I mean, we are less than 100 years from when the Holocaust happened. Europe is still a very anti-Semitic place. Now, luckily, the anti-Semitism isn't, you know, state sanctioned, right? And there are guardrails for this kind of stuff, but it can be debated. But generally speaking, you know, if you look at case by case, of course that can be debated. Like in France with a recent horrific attack and the whatever, we won't get into that, but in general, you know, I'm not saying that it's the same Europe that it was, but they've done polls, and the masses in Europe still hold largely anti-Semitic views, and you know, it's not because of these guardrails, you know, and these laws in place. You know, Jews, which have been largely left Europe, as we know. I mean, 5,000 Jews just left France, most of them citing anti-Semitism in recent years. But my point is that because there are these guardrails in place, right? Like never again will it happen in Europe, right? Europe has to get out their obsession with Jews in some sort of other way, right? They need some sort of emotional outlet, right? It's like they're because we know that anti-Semitism is at its core, it's a conspiracy theory. Jews are a scapegoat, right? Jews are seen as responsible for society's problems, right? So it's an obsession, right? It's a focus on the Jewish community where there doesn't need to be a focus. And Europeans have essentially gotten involved in this issue where they should have nothing to do with this. This is an issue between Arabs and Israelis. It is unconscionable to imagine that the European Union, or even countries like Switzerland, which are not EU members, should involve themselves in these types of disputes, these types of real estate disputes, right, on the ground. And so what has emerged for me in writing this is a very clear transference of anti-Semitism from European soil to now the Jewish state, because the Europeans just they cannot, you know, they cannot exist without without some way, you know, putting their energy into stopping the Jews from belonging, from exercising self-determination, and from existing, you know, in their full capacity as proud Jews, whether that's in Europe or their homeland.
So I don't want to get too much into the esoteric and perhaps philosophical, but I would point out that from the pre-state era, during World War II, the leadership of the Palestinian Arabs sided clearly with Hitler. As a matter of fact, the suggestion to use gas to exterminate Jews came from none other than Haj Amin al-Husseini, the head of the Palestinian Arabs. There was a clear confluence back then, confluence of interests, and there still is today. In some ways, I would say that the Europeans are so eager to accept these false, ridiculous, transparently false Palestinian narratives of historicity, etc. They're eager to accept them because in some ways, turning the Jews into bad guys somehow for some of these countries justifies the way they treated Jews not so long ago. If Jews are so evil and they are doing such terrible things, then we were right to exterminate them in droves, and we were right to herd them into concentration camps, and we were right to expel them and strip them of all of their rights. So there's some sort of shared interest here that is working against us. I'm afraid some things don't change. It sounds extremely defeatist, and I apologize. I'm speaking to you from Israel, and we are at war. It's a war that we all, somewhere in our subconscious, knew was coming. We did not think that we would be taken off guard ever again and massacred in our beds and our homes as we were. But at this point, I don't think there's anyone who in this country, it's not a question of right wing, left wing, whatever your politics are. At this point, no one believes that we can allow those false narratives that are so eagerly soaked up by the Europeans to sway us from doing what we have to do to protect ourselves. It is unfortunate that we in some ways, we're back where we started. But when we say never again, we mean it. And this is a never again moment. So Israel at this point is going to have to face down massive pressure, not only from the Europeans, but also from the Americans, who have political interests of their own, and actually, finally, do what has to be done without concern that these false narratives are going to be thrown at us, and we're going to be accused of the horrific war crimes and apartheid and non-liberalism and racism that Europeans love to accuse us of, because it somehow justifies their own bad behavior. So,
and can I ask,
Sure,
Irina, you had asked, what can be done, and I'm very curious to hear Naomi's answer, because at this point, like you said, I mean, the facts on the ground are there. It's switched now, 60-40, right? I mean, there 20% of land that should have been Israeli jurisdiction is now Palestinian. So if we had the opportunity, if we had the will, if we had the political will, if we had, if we allocated, all the resources, whatever, how could we actually reverse this problem? Is that even possible?
And I'd like to add to that, just 1 second, besides the obvious practical problem that you've pointed out, there are other problems, which is that Israel has mismanaged its economy by continuing with various socialist programs, having eggs and butter shortages at various periods of times, having unionized walkouts, and essentially the sort of foreign ministry unionization, something diplomats working out, things that you'd never hear of in any Western country, or even any other country, frankly. You've had so that's one issue, this dependency on external support that was created over its history and has not really been broken at any point in time. There's an information warfare failure. This information that I'm hearing from you now has not gotten into any international textbooks. It has not been really brought up before international audiences. Most people have no idea it's even an issue. Most people are completely misinformed. The same Europeans, many of them, not everybody is an anti-Semite, but many people are misinformed about the reality, because all they know is what they know from the media, from the education, and from political statements by their leadership. So how do we combat, in addition to the reality of political leaders in Europe funding this insanity and the Palestinians taking full advantage of it, and how do we also address these state-level failures to do an adequate job of protecting their own interests?
Well, I can't speak for the Israeli government. I can speak, unfortunately, much of my time is spent not during times of war, attacking the Israeli government, suing the Israeli government actually on a daily basis, trying to force them to behave like a responsible, sovereign government. Right now we're at war, so I'm going to refrain from doing that in the way that I normally do. I can't agree with you more that there have been systemic failures. What I would say, and at this point, I'm willing to give the Israeli governments over the past 25 years the benefit of the doubt and say that they actually hoped that they had a partner for peace. Some of us never believed that. Some of us, unfortunately, have been proven right. Many of us have hoped that the government would do some of the things and continue to do some of the things that Netanyahu began to do when he became Minister of the Economy here and later Prime Minister, and that is to privatize, to reform, to disband those massive socialist remnants that have done so much damage to our economy. We're hoping that whoever is elected after all the dust settles here in the next round of elections will continue to do those things. But as you say, there are massive, still some of the largest power structures in this country are the last gasps of socialism, some of the most powerful socialist frameworks on the planet that still exist outside of communist China. And they wield tremendous power and tremendous influence over our economy, and that has other ramifications, such as all the labor unions, such as all these shortages, such as control over so many different aspects of our economy. It's a huge battle. It's rebuilding Israel from the ground up. Much progress has been made. We have to give him that. The Netanyahu government, two times ago or whatever, when there were massive international crises, Israel fared those storms relatively well and came out unscathed, and our economy was booming. You have to understand that we're an extremely small country with extremely large and well-funded enemies, and so much of our gross national product goes into defending ourselves. We have indeed created certain types of dependency, and I wouldn't say it's well, at this particular moment, I think most Israelis are aware of it. Our dependency, our, let's say, codependency on the American economy for our military supplies and things of that nature have benefited the United States tremendously, although people like to complain in the US Congress about aid to Israel. It actually is what is keeping many, many industries in the United States afloat. But it comes at a huge price for Israel. The condition for getting US military aid, as it were, means that we are not allowed to develop our own military production, and that means we're dependent. So the United States has now got Israel by the throat and has actually threatened not to resupply or supply arms or spare parts during a time of war if we don't resupply our enemies in Gaza. So the United States has its own reasons for wanting us to provide aid to Hamas and keep them alive. It has its own reasons for wanting us to continue to supply the Palestinian Authority, which is no friend of ours either. And all of these things, essentially, Israel has submitted to. And I don't think there's anyone in Israel today that believes that that is going to be allowed to continue when all of this is over. It mustn't. We have learned once again that we have to be self-sufficient. Even our allies have their own interests and their own realpolitik, and we have to have our own as well. And we have to pursue them, and we have to defend them, and we have to be vigilant because no one else is going to. So things after this, and I don't know when it will be over, and it doesn't look like it's going to be over very soon. But there's a lot of hard, long-term recalibration that needs to be done. Some of it is economic, quite a lot of it, actually. Some of it is military. Much of it is political and diplomatic. and it's beginning to, old paradigms are imploding. The ones that didn't explode are imploding. So hopefully we'll be able to pick up the pieces rather quickly. Some of the things that we have been recommending for years, practical steps, one of them that Karys mentioned is disbanding the civil administration, taking the civilian issues involved in areas that were retaken by the state of Israel in 1967. And I would stress here, you cannot consider, under international law, Israel cannot be considered an occupier over the Green Line, nor can we annex under international law. We can't annex because that territory was and still remains under international law part of the original borders mandated by the United Nations when Israel was established. So you can't actually annex territory that belonged to your country, was illegally occupied for 19 years and then retaken. What we would simply have to do is declare that we no longer consider these contested territories. These are part and parcel of the state of Israel, certainly Area C, and be vigilant about exerting Israeli jurisdiction and extending Israeli law to all of that territory, conducting a census, offering full citizenship to all of the Arabs who live in that territory legally, and demanding that the Palestinian Authority use the massive resources that it receives, both from Israel and from abroad, to improve the lives and to create a future for the people under its jurisdiction in the areas under its full control. That could involve creating a confederation or a federation with other Arab countries nearby, particularly countries with which Israel has full relations and peaceful relations. The citizenship that was revoked from the Arabs of the West Bank by Jordan should be reinstated. The citizenship and responsibility of Egypt for the residents of the Gaza Strip should be reinstated. All these things are fully in line with international law, and these countries should be held to the standards of international law, not only Israel.
Well, interesting.
And they're absolutely.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to make one quick point. I think in terms of the international perspective, I'm definitely of the same camp of Naomi. I'm of the Yoram Ettinger camp, who believes, who's been talking, who's been beating this drum for decades, saying that there should really be a decoupling of Israel and the United States, and the aid shouldn't just be cut off like that. It should be a gradual weaning for sure. But eventually, I completely agree with Naomi. It's not, Israel needs to be able to do what is in her own interest, right? Her citizens' interest, and especially in the last 2 weeks, as we've seen from the administration. Maybe the rhetoric has been on point at times, but we've seen behind the scenes and the actions taken that America has its thumb on every single thing that Israel wants to do. I mean, it's horrendous that we are preventing that America is preventing Israel from doing all that it needs to do to protect its citizens. So, and the reason why America is able to do that is because of the leverage that comes from aid. So if there's not a decoupling in that way, and I know this is very controversial, and a lot of Zionists would think that, a lot of fellow Zionists would think that it's atrocious to say that, America shouldn't be giving aid to Israel. But I think that in the long term, it actually prevents Israel from making smart choices.
I would point out
one second. I'm just going to push back on that a little bit, because I'm not entirely sure that without US aid, Israel would be making smarter choices. Quite the contrary, I have seen a lot of the instincts of the Israeli politicians to go in the direction of Russia and China and attempt some sort of rapprochement, which also backfired tremendously during this Hamas campaign. So I'm not entirely sure that complete independence from Israel, from the United States, is going to lead to better policies. It could lead to actually worse policies, as long as you have politicians who are not dedicated to complete independence of industry, but rather gravitating between different power circles under the guise of supposedly independent policies.
Well, I
say
don't think that decoupling, one second, Naomi. I don't think that decoupling, right, means that America would not still be our strongest ally and our friend, right? I mean, there could still be agreements and MOUs and partnerships and all of that, right? But it just, in terms of those aid packages, right, that go through Congress, I think that ends up having a kind of a regressive effect. So I just want to be clear about that. But go ahead, Naomi.
I just want to venture a guess that the strongest opponents to that are going to be the states in which military equipment is produced in the United States at the moment, iron and metal works. All of these industries in the United States depend tremendously. The aeronautical industry, all of these industries depend tremendously on the United States being the sole supplier of Israel's military needs.
But what do you think is going to happen if those aid packages stop? Do you not think that this will result in the loss of political support for the people who otherwise would have zero buy-in into Israel? Otherwise, the various industries that push for these packages are also the same industries that push for political and military support for Israel at times of war, which creates, understandably, a complicated dynamic. But without it, you might have less support and you might have less of an ally, quite frankly.
Altogether possible, although I'm not sure how close of an ally we have right now, and that remains to be seen. The United States has not made unqualified support for Israel, other than lip service for unqualified support for Israel, has not made any actual moves in that direction in the current conflict. Will it be worse if there's less support? I find it hard to believe, since so much of US intelligence depends on Israel's intelligence. And I think that there has to be a reevaluation. I'm not calling for complete about face. I'm not calling for cutting off ties with the United States of America, as you probably can surmise from my accent. That is where I was born and raised. And I don't think that is wise. But I think that it should not be, first of all, should not be all or nothing. Israel should be able to have enough of an industry that can be kicked into action if there is some sort of confrontation or some sort of blockade, some sort of embargo. We've seen this too many times before in our history. It's a very short history with a lot of political intrigue with the United States and supplies in times of war. We have to learn that lesson. But Israel is not in the position that it was 50 and 60 and 70 years ago, where we have nothing to offer. We have a lot to offer, and we continue to offer, and we continue to be one of the most important sources for intelligence for democracies around the world. Something should be made clear, that there's some sort of other quid pro quo involved here, and we are not a vassal state, and we can, although it is in our interest always to continue to cooperate with other democracies, to share that intelligence, to fight worldwide terrorism with worldwide allies, all of those things don't necessarily dictate that we become completely dependent on one supplier, on one country, on the goodwill of one administration. All of these things have to be reevaluated. I'm not saying beyond that. I'm obviously not a military strategist, but there's a problem. There's certainly a problem. And the pressure that Israel is suffering from right now from all directions is unbearable from where I'm sitting.
And I think,
yes,
I think we can all agree that Israel needs more diverse and better allies in general. It cannot, it's dependency on any one factor is never a good thing. But we have seen efforts in that direction through Abraham Accords. We have seen Israel's very, very good diplomacy when it comes to African countries, to Latin American countries. Some of it backfired as soon as the regimes in those countries have changed. Latin America is notoriously unstable. African countries, we have seen the coups, we have seen the Russian and Chinese influence, which is never pro-Israel, no matter what people like to think. And we are seeing that the European Union, of course, is where it is. So there's we have also seen that while you are quite correct that Israel's intelligence and its cybersecurity and its various military capabilities are a huge asset, we have seen that when there are campaigns, international campaigns that undermine those assets, that instigate hatred, instigate political revelation of Israel's contributions, Israel is unable to offer a coherent response, which actually weakens its capabilities and leaves it helpless. We have seen what happened with the Pegasus campaign and the political aftermath, and at the time, Defense Minister Gantz deciding rather than to respond to these campaigns, cut off relations with cut off this provision of this cybersecurity to a variety of Middle Eastern countries for whom that was may have been the only reason to have relations with Israel to begin with. So we are seeing a lot of this political and information mismanagement that undermines all of these Israel's capabilities that it could be using to defend its sovereignty. How do we go about it? This what topic we've been discussing today is just one example, but it's one example of many, and all of them come with a package. There's a complete failure of outreach. We've seen the public diplomacy minister resign over Hasbara failure. Cherry tomatoes are not going to respond to emotional human rights campaigns on campuses, and the new forms of BDS that have emerged, and such as these political anti-Israeli intelligence campaigns, they're certainly not going to educate the young Europeans about the falsehoods they're being fed. Where do we go from there?
It's a wonderful question. I think maybe we should start a campaign to elect Irina Zuckerman as Minister of our public defender, number one. The only thing that we can do is try to disseminate truth, fact. And again, Regavim has for the past 17 years been engaged in fact finding and publication of facts only, legal work based on fact. We deal only with things that can stand up in a court of law, either internally or externally. And we try very hard to get that information out to the public. That is my job. So if it hasn't happened, that's my responsibility and my fault. And we're working on it. We try to create, to offer that facts to anyone willing to consider them. And we invite everyone to read our reports, to use our website as a resource, to follow our casework, and to follow the issues as we present them, because we will not present something that is not based in actual fact. So when facts when false narratives, fake news, lies, anti-Semitism flood all of the networks and all of the platforms and all social media, the best that we can do is to hope that people will actually try to look further, to hear the other side, to try to examine the facts for themselves and make reasoned judgments based on fact. And that's what we try to provide.
But how do we get this information out to people who have no way of normally even looking for it? How do we engage the audiences that would not be typically looking into this question, who are passive consumers of information, and unfortunately often false or subjective information from their governments, media environments, and so forth? How do we get the people who really need to hear all of this to actually engage? Is there a way to support more active outreach, more engaged advocacy, ambassadors of this message, of this information, to the places, to the countries where they would normally not be familiar with this, whether it's the Arab world, whether it's the European Union, or for that matter, the United States and their academia?
Well, I think that, yeah, it's a very, very difficult, right? I mean, it's hard to get out of one's own network and echo chamber. I feel like I'm slowly starting to be able to do that just by virtue of the fact that I work for Epoch Times. This is not the Epoch Times is not a Jewish or Israeli outlet, right? We are actually first and foremost concerned with China. And yet, you know, I've done quite a few media appearances this week on different Epoch shows, right? And that is getting information out to an audience that wouldn't normally be familiar. So I think personal networks are very important. If we know people, you know, personally that are outside of this space, I think it's very important to invite ourselves into that space and talk to other people. There was also something else that I wanted to say, but I can't seem to recall what it is. So maybe in a minute it'll come to me.
Okay. I will say that I've had, unfortunately, I wrote an op-ed piece while sitting in my bomb shelter. It was raw, it was kind of visceral, it was rather long, but it addressed some of the the larger issues. I sent it off to a whole bunch of classic media outlets for consideration for publication as an opinion piece. Not one of them would publish it. Eventually it went up on in my mind, an important source of information for Zionists throughout the world. The JNS has a digital website and they published it. And I'm tired of preaching to the choir. And that's the problem.
Send it to me, Naomi, next time, and we'll get it up on Epoch Times. Epoch has over 1 million subscribers, and most of Epoch subscribers know nothing about this. Okay. But Epoch is largely sympathetic to Israel, and you know, we don't have any, you know, BBC policy of calling, you know, Hamas militants or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, we can send it to me and we'll get it up in Epoch Times. Unfortunately, most of our stuff is behind a paywall, but we have so many subscribers that it's still things still get it's
so
still
I mean, it's an uphill battle. It's a tremendous grind every day. Now that in the digital era there are more outlets, and we try to share as much information on a daily basis as possible, but facts again.
I remember what I was going to say. I think that, you know, out of such darkness can come light, and right now this is one of the most horrific moments in Jewish history, and yet I'm starting to see little cracks in the Palestinian narrative among people who might have been more sympathetic to them, right? I think that while it's true, we've seen these outbursts of anti-Semitism, you know, that I haven't seen in my lifetime, right? Just horrific manifestations, especially across Europe, but also in the US. I've also seen a lot of people who would otherwise maybe be neutral or maybe sympathetic to Palestinians say things like, you know, I never understood how something like the Holocaust could happen, and now I get it. I've heard that line from many people. And so I think that if there's any silver lining to such a tragic moment, it is that maybe parts of the world are now woken up to the plight of what we're facing that wouldn't have been before, because the entire world is focused on this right now, and people are forced to see, you know, the genocidal Jew hatred that is coming from the Palestinian side, when maybe they've never even thought about it for a moment in their lives. So maybe something like this can be the thing that changes the tide of public opinion. I don't know.
I certainly think
within Israel,
moment.
Within Israel, there's some sort of awakening as well. People who were champion leftists, who, I mean, unfortunately and tragically, the communities that were overrun and the people who were either murdered or abducted 2 weeks ago, many of them are main founding figures of Israel's coexistence movements, peace movements, far left movements, and they, unfortunately, the ones who've survived are recalibrating and reconsidering everything they thought about our quote unquote partners for peace and the way forward. It's going to take quite a long time for people to recollect their thoughts and rebuild their entire thought framework. It's not something that can happen overnight. But in terms of getting messages out, facts about the facts that we collect and that we have been shouting from the rooftops for 17 years, any suggestions are welcome. That's all I'll say. We try to send them to diplomats. I actually traveled before the COVID outbreak to Brussels to meet with parliamentarians in the European Parliament and to present facts to them. 17 parliamentarians out of hundreds agreed to meet with me, and some took what we had to say and filed it in what we call the circular file, which is the rubbish bin, and others actually, some of them have since then used some of the facts and stayed in touch and have used some of the facts to actually call into question European policy regarding funding for illegal activities of the Palestinian Authority. So I'm hoping that more of them will be open at this point to receiving fact and analysis and not just narrative that supports where they want to go to begin with.
I think Israel has allies in surprising places that might be more open. I think I would look at Eastern Europe and some of the stations there, because I don't particularly think they're big proponents of Gaza or Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. I think they see more value in Israel, and I think they are equally concerned about some of these Islamist and other movements and Russia-backed movements. I think there is a point of contention. I think there's a point where you can bring some of these unusual allies into the fold, use that collective pressure to start the dialogue within the European Union between its different members. I don't think Israel should be the only one fighting that battle, and I think presenting it as only Israel's issue to fight is a mistake. I think there is a tendency in Israel to try to be very self-sufficient and well, we can do it all and it's our problem, and but I think actually letting in allies and bringing them into dialogue is a good thing. I think trying to create maybe workshops for younger Europeans who are not familiar with these issues, not familiar with the history of the Oslo Accords, not familiar with the law, is a start. Not everybody is, born an anti-Semite and is completely brainwashed. They simply may need more accurate information and to hear a narrative different from what they used to being fed every day of their lives. So I think there is a tremendous potential to start pushing this information. Whether or not the Israeli government chooses to do anything with it, I hope they do, because right now, as you said, is a tremendous opportunity, and we should not be losing that moment when there is a level of sympathy and openness that might change as the war drags on.
Let me just add one thing about your comments, which I think are extremely insightful. But I would say from my perspective, the reason Israel has not done this and has not approached those nations is because that would force us to frame this in a way that Israel has avoided doing studiously for far too long, and that is that at its heart, this is not a conflict about territory. This is a religious war. Israel has never wanted to go in that direction. It is not a popular direction. Unfortunately, at this point, it may be an unavoidable direction. And the nations that you mentioned, the Eastern European nations, emerging countries that are dealing with some of these same Islamist forces, they're aware already, but Israel has been really reticent in terms of framing this as a religious war. That may have to end in order to enlist support and to create partnerships with other countries that are dealing with these phenomena. You have to call it what it is, and it is a religious war at its heart.
And and Hamas for sure has never made a secret of it. The PA that was originally Soviet funded had tried to turn it into this pseudo liberation movement. By the way, none of the Soviet backed liberation movements have resulted in anything remotely positive for any of the territories or peoples that they have tried to support. The Kurds are still without a state. The Palestinians are in worse shape than they would have been without the Soviet meddling, and and micro communities all over the world are all in a similar situation, ruled by corrupt puppet regimes and not without any real future. So that is a narrative that also needs to shift, that these so-called liberation movements were ever really about anyone's liberation. But what you're saying about religious war, Hamas has made no secret of what they are, who funds them. This Muslim Brotherhood narrative needs to shift. It's the Arab states, I know for a fact, for a period of time, have tried to push very hard. Now we're seeing that because this narrative has been ignored, some of these same Islamists are coming back to power. And they're pushing back against the reforms that have been achieved in the Arab world in the past few years. And this is a good moment for Israel to finally wake up and say, what do we have in common with our neighbors? What do we, what will they see as a threat to their own well-being that will make them want to join us? This is, I think, is a very good time.
Agreed.
Thank you so much both for these really insightful comments, for this tremendously stimulating and provocative discussion, and that I think needs to get out a lot more. I personally learned a great deal, and I think it's important to exchange perspective. I think the American Jewish perspective and just American perspective in general is terribly disconnected with Israel, which is a shame. We talk a lot past each other instead of talking to each other and listening to each other's concerns. I think that's been also a tremendous failure of public policy on everyone's side, not just Israel. I think a lot of Americans just mean well, but just don't get it. And I think this is the time to kind of start seeing the issues that are Israel's as international threats, because Hamas is not going to stop with the Israelis. They're connected to other Muslim Brotherhood proxies, other Iranian proxies. They certainly threatened to attack other places in their comments recently, and they've certainly made no secret of the level of support they have during these latest riots. And quite frankly, the Palestinian Authority is hardly any better in that respect. It's the same people funding the same terrorists. So what is a threat to Israel now will probably be, you'll be seeing these guys joining the ranks of Hezbollah in Germany or France in very near future. And I think it's time for these conversations to happen more broadly. I think it's time to reframe the discussions from Israel's problems to everyone's problem. And for those watching us, of course, this was Karys, Rhea, who's written an amazing article, Naomi, Kahn, who's been doing a tremendous research job looking at these legal violations, what they mean for Israel's security, and now, as we're seeing more broadly, what they mean for foreign policy, for foreign relations between Israel, US, European Union, and the rest of the world. Very, very much a global issue, and not just an issue of Israel's real estate. It should be a local issue, should be a local conflict that should be resolvable by the parties, but the founders of PA, the backers of Hamas, have made it into a global problem, and it should be dealt with as such. And the funding that has created a generation of terrorists and haters should be addressed more broadly, because it is a threat now beyond Israel. They've created a monster that they can no longer control. That's the reality. Those watching us will be back next week, as always, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. EST. Thank you so much. The Washington Outsider Report with you. Have a great night.